Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy you can be with us today. It's kind of a cool day outside, but it's pretty nice, really. Though there's no clouds or anything that I can see. It's just a little on the cool side. We're going to be in session 10 today, and the title of the chapter, that section that we're going to be in, is called "Returning." This is going to be taken out of Mark chapter 13, verses 24 through 37. You know, Jesus promised to return for us, for his followers. So keep that in mind as we go through today's lesson. You know, many people know the experience of waiting on a bus, or waiting on a taxi, or waiting on something. Most importantly, most of them are waiting at the doctor's office. So we know and have experienced times of having to wait. You know, and usually if we're waiting for a bus, if it's more than a minute late, we get a little apprehensive, and then we get a little anxious about it the longer it takes for it to get there. You know, if we just looked at things and say, what if something happened and the bus is not coming today? We get all upset about this. Anticipation can create excitement, but it can also create worry. So there's no use worrying whether the bus is going to get there or not. But there's one thing that we know that we don't have to worry about, is when Christ said he will return, he will return. So but let's go on in and look at understanding the context a little bit today. And that's going to be taken from Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 37. Now we can see in Mark 11 that Jesus cursed the fig tree and cleansed the temple. That was in our last lesson last Wednesday. He cursed the fig tree and cleansed the temple. Now, this was not expected. Nobody expected this. The Jews wanted a Messiah who would remove Roman oppression, not to purify the Jewish ways of worship. They didn't want that. See, the chief priests and scribes confronted this challenge through their authority when Jesus done it. But they could not answer the question that Jesus posed to them about the baptism of John the Baptist. Now, the Lord's actions and the temple led him to a series of teachings that further confronted the authority of the religious leaders. If you remember, he spoke about the parable of the vineyard, and he answered the challenge of the Pharisees and the Herodians, who asked him if it was lawful to pay taxes. And of course, you all remember what he said, and it led him to say, "Give to Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and to God the things which belong to God." Now, this answer silenced most of his critics at that time. But we can see now, as Jesus left the temple, one of his disciples noted the massive stones and impressive buildings. And that's going to be starting in chapter 13, verses 1. Herod's temple, which stood in Jesus' day, was impressive. And it was one of Herod's most notable contributions, was this magnificent stonework of the temple. Now, he extended to the largest portions in the history of the temple. It was big. It was huge. These sights must have impressed the disciples, but they did not impress Jesus. Now, Jesus spoke of a day when the great stones and buildings would be torn down. Now, this discussion about the destruction of the temple led into Jesus' teaching about his second coming. Now, Jesus spoke about the end of the age. He spoke of signs of the ends of times and the great period of tribulation that would precede his return. And now, in this context, the words of this week's passage occur, okay? Now let's go on in and read verses 24 and 25. And we're going to call these verses, "Be Ready." "But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not shed its light. The stars will be falling from the sky, and the powers of the heaven will be shaken." Now, the phrase "in those days" was a common Old Testament expression of prophecy that looked forward to future events. So that's what "in those days" kind of meant in the Old Testament times. Now, Jesus said that these events would happen after that tribulation. Now the Jews would experience days of tribulation at the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. But so would Christians experience a period of tribulation prior to Jesus' return. Now that's in Revelation 7:14. It tells us about those tribulations that we will experience. Now, in these verses we can see that Jesus described the days of tribulation in terms of cosmic apocalyptic signs. These were allusions to the Old Testament ideal of the day of the Lord. Now, if you read Isaiah chapter 13, verses 9 through 10, and then 24, verses 23, and chapter 34, verse 4, then you'll know what the day of the Lord is, okay? The first two signs that Jesus talked about were the sun will be darkened and the moon will not shed its light. These were also the events John revealed in Revelation chapter 6, verse 12. Jesus also stated that the stars will be falling from the sky. This too was mentioned by John in Revelation 6:13. When Jesus returns, all the powers in the heavens will be shaken. The whole earth and sky would be rocked and shaken by God's judgment. Let's look at verses 26 and 27 now. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. He will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. You know, in one big climactic moment, everyone's going to see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. Now, in the Old Testament, God's presence was often in a cloud. If you remember Exodus chapter 19, verses 9. And of course in 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 10 to 11. You'll see all this where it talks about the Son of Man coming in a cloud. Now the term Son of Man connects this passage with Daniel's prophecy about the coming days of the Lord. And it says that suddenly one like a Son of Man was coming with the clouds of heaven. And that's Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. The coming of Christ is described with two terms, power and glory. Both of these terms that were used here to describe were used to describe God in the Old Testament. Now this is an obvious contrast with the way that Christ first came to earth. You remember he was born in Bethlehem, not Jerusalem. He was born in a stable and laid in a manger. Power and glory were not words that would describe his first coming, but his power and glory will be on full display in his second coming. When Jesus returns, it will be with the angels, and the angels will gather his elect. Now, the elect are those who have a relationship with God through Christ. And you can see that in Deuteronomy 30, verse 4, Psalms 147, verse 2, Isaiah chapter 11, verse 12, and you can look in Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and see it in other places there. No place or person will be overlooked when Jesus comes to gather his followers. Now the angels will go from the four winds. Now this is an expression that's used 6 times in the Old Testament to describe the entirety of the earth. Every place where the wind blows is where the angels will go to gather his elect. It also occurs in Revelation chapter 7, verse 1, where it again describes the entirety of the earth or any place where the wind blows. See, the angels are said to travel from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Jesus challenged his disciples to make disciples of all nations. So one might expect believers to come from the four winds of heaven and the ends of the earth. When Jesus returns, regardless of where a person is on the earth, he or she must be ready. So we must all be ready for Jesus' second coming. Now, the next set of verses we're going to label beware. So let's look at verses 28 and 29. Learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its branches become tender and sprouts leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see these things happening, recognize that He is near at the door. See, Jesus encourages those who's listening to take a lesson from the fig tree. This was an agricultural parable describing the imminence of the signs of Jesus' return. See, most of the trees in the Middle East were evergreen trees, but some, like the fig tree, shed their leaves in the winter and re-emerged in the spring with new growth. Now, the re-emergence of new leaves meant that summer was around the corner, and Jesus used this commonly known parable to describe the coming judgment both at the time of the fall of Jerusalem and the return of Jesus Christ. See, the arrival of summer was an anticipated event and happened suddenly as the branches became tender and sprouted leaves, just as it does today. Jesus didn't want his disciples to despair over the coming signs of judgment. He encouraged them to look with anticipation toward his return. Now, every one of us should look with anticipation for the return of Christ. See, Jesus explained the illustration of the fig tree by saying that when they saw these things happening, they were to recognize that He is near. Now, what are these things to which Jesus referred? Was He referring to His coming and gathering of the elect? Or did He include the signs that would accompany the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple? In typical prophetic fashion, Jesus had woven together judgment upon the nation of Israel with the judgment awaiting unbelievers at the end of time. You remember what we said about the fig tree last week. He made the Jewish people aware that the fall of Jerusalem was near, and yet at the same time He made Christians aware that His return could come at any time. Now, some translations of the Bible render the phrase translated, He is near, as it is near. Both ways are accurate, and both are possible because Jesus seemed to be referring to both of them. Jesus wanted His followers to know that they had to be aware of the coming judgment of God, whether it was on the nation when Jerusalem fell, or at any time upon those who do not believe in Jesus. Like the summer, which was around the corner, judgment was standing at the door. When Jesus returned, that judgment would fall on all unbelievers. So when Jesus returns, the unbelievers' judgment's going to fall. Let's look at verses 30 and 31. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. We can see that Jesus declared that this generation will certainly not pass away until all things take place. Now, what generation was Jesus indicating? And what were those, and what did He mean by all these things? Some have said Jesus was referring to His own generation, and all these things were only the events of the fall of Jerusalem. But would that have included Jesus' return in verses 24 and 27, which still has yet to occur? Now, the best explanation of this verse is that this generation included all those who believed and would believe until the time of Jesus. The people in Jesus' day would begin to experience suffering, and that would accumulate in the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. But that would not end the suffering. It would still be there prior to the return of Christ. Every person will face difficult days prior to Christ's return. And this should only encourage us as believers to continue preparing ourselves for the return of Christ. Now, though heaven and earth would pass away, Jesus stated that His words would never pass away. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 8 states that only God's words are eternal. What does this say about Jesus? He was God. Through all of heaven and earth would pass away, his words would stand eternal. Now this verse must have brought great comfort to those facing the destruction of Jerusalem, and they can bring great comfort to those suffering prior to his second coming. So these words should bring great comfort to all of us. Now, how should looking for signs of the future influence the way we live in the present? Ask yourself that question today. Let me ask you one other question. How should the promise of the return of Christ bring comfort to those enduring difficult times? You see, God in his own time and in his own way will bring the world to its appropriate end. And that's a key doctrine right there. That's something that you can pretty much count on, that it will happen one day and that God is in full control. Now let's look at verse 32 now. And this is, we're going to title it, Be Alert. Now concerning that day or hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son of Man, but only the Father. Now the reference to that day indicates the day of Christ's return. Jesus had previously mentioned those days which preceded his return, but that day would end those days. Jesus stated that no one knows the day of his return. Now, the mystery surrounding the exact day of his return should cause us to avoid predictions about the timing of it and to focus more on the impact of it. And it should have the impact it should have on our lives in the present is what we should be focusing on. Those who claim to know the time of his return clearly stand in violation of Jesus' words here. Because Jesus said, no one knows. Then he went on further to say, even the angels in heaven do not know the day of Christ's return. So speculation is pointless here. Jesus also indicated that the Son did not know, only the Father. Now, if Jesus was God, how did he not know the date? Now, in the incarnation or taking of human flesh, the form of human flesh, Jesus evidently laid aside the exercise of his deity in this area. He was still fully God and diminished in his deity. However, he willingly laid aside some of his divine rights, as in Mark chapter 10, verse 40, where Jesus said it was not his right to give the ability to sit at his right or the left in the kingdom. Even though he was God, he laid aside some things where he was human. He laid aside some of his divine rights. Okay, let's look at verses 33 through 35 now. Watch, be alert, for you don't know when the time is coming. It is like a man on a journey who left his house and gave authority to his servants, gave each one his work, and commanded the doorkeeper to be alert. Therefore be alert, since you don't know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening or at midnight or at the crowing of the rooster or early in the morning. See, instead of speculating about the time, Jesus instructed his followers to watch and be alert. These same things hold true for us today. Watch and be alert. Watching for Christ should lead to working for Christ. Now, Jesus told a parable to explain what waiting and being alert looks like. A man on a journey entrusted his servants to do certain jobs, and he asked the doorkeeper to remain alert, because the doorkeeper did not know the exact time of the master's return. He had to be watchful, even in the 4 watches of the night, which is evening, midnight, the crowing of the rooster, and in the morning. Since it was not customary to travel in the night, the workers could have been caught unaware when the master returned. Let's look at verse 36. and 36 and 37. Otherwise, when he comes, suddenly he might find you sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to everyone, be alert. See, Jesus' parable exposed the embarrassment of the workers sleeping when they should have been working. Suddenly indicated a time when they did not expect it, meaning they had to always be alert. To be alert for the return of Christ does not mean sitting in inactivity, waiting for him to return. It means being busy doing the things to prepare for his coming. We have a gospel to share with a world that needs to hear it. And Jesus told the disciples to relay that message to all believers. Everyone needed to be alert and ready for the return of Christ. You know, as believers, we should rejoice over the promised return of Jesus. Now, as believers, we can live with confidence knowing that our lives are the basis of the promises of Jesus. I'm sorry, let me read that again. Believers can live with confidence when they base their lives on the promise of Jesus. Believers should continually look for the return of Jesus. So today, how do we see God's wisdom in not revealing when Jesus will return? So think about that question today. I've already have my own answer to it, but I'd like to hear what yours is. God bless you until we see each other again. Stay warm, and hopefully we'll see each other again very soon. God bless.